In the heart of Boston's affluent Beacon Hill, where cobblestone streets whisper tales of old money and tradition, Michael Chen built his fortune from scratch. At just 35, he owned one of the fastest-growing tech companies in New England, but you'd never guess it from his worn jeans and simple button-down shirts. Michael believed true character shone through actions, not appearances, a philosophy that would soon be put to the ultimate test. Sarah Richardson, his fiancée of 6 months, came from what she called traditional New England stock. Her parents, the ever-proper Dr. James and Mrs. Patricia Richardson, lived in a sprawling colonial mansion where family portraits dated back generations. They'd been less than thrilled when their daughter announced her engagement to a man they'd never met, especially one who, as far as they knew, worked as a mid-level software developer. "They're just set in their ways," Sarah would say, her voice tinged with apologetic undertones whenever she spoke about her parents. But Michael had heard the whispers during country club gatherings, seen the sideways glances when he picked Sarah up from family events in his 15-year-old Toyota. The Richardsons had made their expectations clear through carefully worded emails and polite but distant phone calls. Tonight was different, though. After 6 months of polite deflections, the Richardsons had finally invited Michael for dinner. Dressed appropriately, the invitation had specified. Michael smiled at those words as he adjusted his intentionally ill-fitting thrift store blazer in his car's rearview mirror. Inside his pocket, he carried something that would change everything: the latest financial magazine with his company's billion-dollar valuation splashed across the cover. The evening started exactly as he'd anticipated. Dr. Richardson's firm handshake came with a barely concealed grimace at Michael's scuffed shoes. Mrs. Richardson's eyes darted to her daughter with silent disapproval as she noticed his $10 watch. The soup course arrived with a side of thinly veiled questions about Michael's modest career choices and his interesting background. "So, Michael," Dr. Richardson began, cutting into his perfectly seared steak, "how exactly do you plan to provide for our daughter on a programmer's salary?" Sarah's accustomed to certain standards. The question hung in the air like heavy perfume, making Sarah shift uncomfortably in her chair. Mrs. Richardson chimed in, silver spoon clinking against fine china. "We just want to ensure Sarah maintains the lifestyle she deserves. You understand, of course." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she gestured to their surroundings: the antique furniture, crystal chandelier, and original artwork that screamed old money. Michael reached for his water glass, allowing his blazer to ride up just enough to reveal the magazine's edge in his pocket. He'd spent months planning this moment, waiting for the perfect time to show them who he really was. But as he observed their subtle sneers and watched Sarah's growing discomfort, he wondered if exposing his true worth would really change anything. Would it make them see beyond their prejudices, or would it only prove that money, not character, was all they cared about? His hand moved toward his pocket, fingers brushing against the glossy magazine cover. The dining room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. In that moment, Michael made a decision that would either bridge the divide or blow everything apart. As he began to reach for the magazine, Mrs. Richardson's dessert plate slipped from her hands, and what happened next would leave everyone at the table speechless. The fine bone china plate shattered against the hardwood floor, sending pieces skittering across the Persian rug. But it wasn't the broken plate that caused the stunned silence that followed. It was what tumbled from Michael's pocket as he instinctively reached to help: the magazine, landing face up beneath the crystal chandelier, its cover catching the light perfectly. Ken Tech's Unstoppable Rise: How This Self-Made Billionaire is Reshaping the Industry. The headline blazed across the glossy surface, and there was Michael's photo wearing a tailored suit worth more than the Richardsons' chandelier, standing in front of his company's gleaming headquarters. Dr. Richardson's fork clattered against his plate. Mrs. Richardson's hand flew to her pearl necklace, her face draining of color. Sarah, who had known about Michael's success but honored his wish to keep it private, couldn't help but smile as years of her parents' prejudices crumbled before her eyes. But Michael wasn't looking at any of them. His mind raced back to 12 years ago when he'd arrived in Boston with nothing but a laptop and a dream. He remembered the landlords who wouldn't rent to him, the investors who wouldn't meet with him, and the country clubs that mysteriously had no membership openings. Each rejection had only fueled his determination. I don't understand," Mrs. Richardson stammered, her earlier composure completely shattered. "You mean to tell me that you're—" She couldn't even finish the sentence, her eyes darting between the magazine and Michael's worn jeans. Dr. Richardson had gone very still, his expression unreadable as he stared at the magazine's cover. The same man he'd been condescending to all evening was featured in last month's 40 Under 40 list. The same man he'd questioned about providing for his daughter had just donated a new wing to the very hospital where he practiced. "Why didn't you tell us?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, but what he was really asking was clear. "Why did you let us reveal ourselves so completely?" Sarah reached for Michael's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. She'd witnessed his kindness, his brilliance, and his quiet strength long before she knew about his success. That's why she'd fallen in love with him, despite her parents' disapproval, or perhaps partly because of it. "I believe," Michael said, carefully choosing his words, "that character reveals itself most honestly when people think no one of consequence is watching." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The question is, what do we do with those revelations?" The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking each waited moment. Through the dining room's bay windows, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the antique furniture and family portraits that suddenly seemed less impressive than they had just hours before. Mrs. Richardson opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For the first time in her life, perhaps, she found herself entirely without social script to follow. Her world of careful hierarchies and polite prejudices had been upended, and in its place stood something far more complicated, the truth. But Michael wasn't finished. Reaching into his other pocket, he pulled out something else, something that would make the magazine revelation pale in comparison. As he placed it carefully on the table, next to his barely touched creme brulee, both Sarah and her parents leaned forward, their eyes widening at what they saw. On the pristine white tablecloth lay a small, worn leather journal. Its edges were frayed, and its pages had yellowed with time. "This," Michael said softly, "belonged to your grandfather, Dr. Richardson." His fingers traced the cover gently, reverently. "David Richardson, class of 1948. Dr. Richardson's face paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He knew that journal, had heard stories about it his entire life. It was his father's prized possession, lost decades ago during a time nobody in the family talked about. "Impossible," Mrs. Richardson whispered, but her voice trembled with uncertainty. Sarah looked between her parents and her fiancé, confusion written across her face. This was something she'd never heard about, a piece of family history buried so deep it had almost been forgotten. "Your father," Michael continued, looking directly at Dr. Richardson, "wrote something remarkable in here. Something that changed my life before I even met Sarah." He opened the journal carefully to a marked page, where elegant handwriting filled the margins. In 1948, when he was a medical student, he was saved by a Chinese immigrant doctor who no other physician would work with. That doctor performed an emergency surgery that saved his life, even after being rejected from every hospital in Boston. Dr. Richardson's hands began to shake. He'd heard this story only once, on his father's deathbed. The family had buried it, along with the uncomfortable truths it carried. But how did Michael have this journal? How did he know? "That doctor was my grandfather," Michael revealed, his voice steady but emotional. "He never became bitter, never stopped helping people, even when they looked down on him. Your father wrote in this journal that he learned his greatest lesson in medicine that day, that skill, compassion, and character know no color or creed." The chandelier light caught tears forming in Mrs. Richardson's eyes. Her perfectly maintained facade was crumbling as she looked at the journal, then at Michael, seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time. Sarah reached for the journal with trembling fingers, but Michael wasn't finished. He turned to another page where a faded photograph was carefully preserved. In it, two young men stood side by side in medical coats, one Caucasian and one Asian, both smiling broadly at the camera. "Your father spent the next 20 years trying to change the system from within," Michael continued. He faced ridicule and opposition from his peers for championing diversity in medicine. But he never stopped, and when he lost this journal, he lost his written proof of why he fought so hard. The weight of history hung heavy in the air. Dr. Richardson's stern composure had completely crumbled, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form words, Michael pulled out one final item from his jacket, a piece of paper that would connect all the dots and force everyone at that table to confront not just their prejudices, but their own legacy of both shame and redemption. The paper Michael placed on the table was a deed, not just any deed, but one for the very hospital where Dr. Richardson had built his career. The same hospital where, decades ago, his father and Michael's grandfather had worked to break down barriers. The same hospital that now, ironically, faced closure due to financial troubles. Your hospital's board meeting tomorrow, Michael said quietly, isn't about quarterly reports. It's about selling to a corporate chain that plans to turn it into a luxury medical spa. He watched as Dr. Richardson's face transformed from confusion to horror. As chief of medicine, he'd been deliberately kept in the dark about the true nature of the meeting. Sarah gasped softly. She'd done her residency at that hospital, following in her father's footsteps. It was where she'd first dreamed of becoming a doctor, sitting in her father's office as a little girl, watching him tend to patients from all walks of life. The thought of it becoming another playground for the wealthy was unbearable. But that's not possible, Dr. Richardson protested, his voice hoarse. The board, they wouldn't, but the certainty drained from his face as he remembered the mysterious closed-door meetings, the sudden interest in property values, the quiet transfers of long-term patients. Mrs. Richardson, who sat on several hospital charity committees, sank back in her chair. The fundraising gala next month, she whispered. They canceled it without explanation. Her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, the reality of the situation dawning on her. I've spent the last year quietly buying shares in the hospital, Michael continued, his voice gentle but firm. Not through Chin Tech, but through a separate foundation I created in honor of my grandfather and your father's legacy. As of this morning, I own 48%. He paused, letting the information sink in. But it's not enough to stop the sale. Not without help. Dr. Richardson's eyes snapped up, meeting Michael's gaze. The meaning was clear. Michael wasn't just revealing his wealth or the family's connected past. He was offering a partnership, a chance to save something precious to both families. The foundation needs a medical director, Michael said, someone who understands not just medicine, but the importance of keeping healthcare accessible to everyone. Someone who knows firsthand what happens when prejudice and profit drive medical decisions. His eyes moved meaningfully between Dr. and Mrs. Richardson. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched her parents, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the full scope of what Michael had orchestrated. This wasn't just about proving his worth or exposing their prejudices. It was about something much bigger. A chance to right historical wrongs and preserve a legacy of compassion and change. But as Dr. Richardson reached for the deed with a shaking hand, the dining room door burst open. Standing there was someone nobody had expected to see, someone whose presence would throw everything Michael had carefully planned into chaos. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of the hospital, but the future of both families. In the doorway stood Robert Chen, Michael's father, still wearing his doctor's coat from the free clinic he'd run for 30 years, the same clinic that had finally given his father, the immigrant doctor who saved David Richardson's life, a place to practice after years of rejection. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene before him, lingering on the journal that held so much history. I thought I might find you here, son, he said quietly, his gaze settling on Michael, especially today. He stepped into the dining room, and behind him emerged another figure that made Dr. Richardson stumble back in his chair. His own mother, Eleanor Richardson, now 92 but still carrying herself with unmistakable grace. James, Eleanor said to her son, Dr. Richardson, I think it's time you knew the whole truth. She moved slowly to the table, her eyes fixed on the journal. David didn't lose that journal. I took it. I took it because I was afraid. Afraid of what people would say, afraid of how it would affect our social standing. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Mrs. Richardson covered her mouth with her hand as her mother-in-law continued. "But Robert found it," Eleanor gestured to Michael's father, "when his clinic bought our old house last month. The same house where I'd hidden it all those years ago." Michael stood, understanding flooding his features. He'd wondered how the journal had appeared mysteriously on his desk last week. Now everything made sense. His father and Eleanor had orchestrated their own plan alongside his. "The clinic," Robert Chen said, stepping forward, "is being evicted to make way for luxury condos. The same developers who want to buy the hospital made an offer on that property too." He placed a stack of papers on the table next to Michael's deed. "But they don't know that the clinic owns the land now, thanks to Eleanor's donation. And they don't know that the clinic's board met this morning." Eleanor Richardson straightened her spine, years of regret and redemption evident in her voice. "We voted to merge the clinic with the hospital, under the foundation's leadership. With my son as chief of medicine, Robert running the clinic operations, and Michael providing the business expertise." She paused, smiling at Sarah, and a brilliant young doctor about to finish her residency to bridge it all together. Dr. Richardson looked at his mother, then at Robert Chen, then finally at Michael and Sarah. Decades of prejudice, pride, and misunderstanding began to melt away as he realized the legacy he'd almost lost, and the future he could help build. "Well," Mrs. Richardson said suddenly, standing up and smoothing her dress with shaking hands, "I suppose we should start planning a proper engagement party." She turned to Michael, her eyes glistening. "One that celebrates not just a union of two people, but of two families who have been connected for far longer than any of us knew." But as the group began to smile and reach for each other, Michael's phone buzzed with an urgent message. His eyes widened as he read it. The hospital board had moved up their vote to tonight, and they were meeting in just 30 minutes. The real fight to save both the hospital and the clinic wasn't over yet. In fact, it was about to begin. The next 30 minutes transformed into a whirlwind of action. The unlikely group rushed to the hospital boardroom, Eleanor Richardson insisting on coming despite her age. "I've kept quiet for 40 years, she declared, gripping her walking cane. "I won't miss seeing this made right." They arrived just as the board members were taking their seats. The surprise on the chairman's face when Dr. Richardson burst in with Michael Chen, Robert Chen, and both Richardson women was priceless. But it was Sarah who stepped forward first, her voice clear and confident as she presented the merged proposal they'd hastily outlined during the car ride. "This hospital was built on a promise," she began, glancing at her grandmother and Robert Chen. "A promise that healthcare isn't just for those who can afford luxury, but for everyone who needs it." She laid out their vision, a hospital that would combine the best of modern medicine with the compassionate community care the clinic had always provided. The board members listened, shifting uncomfortably as Michael presented the financial details, proving how the merger would actually increase profitability while maintaining accessibility. Dr. Richardson spoke about his father's legacy, finally sharing the story he'd kept buried for so long. And when Robert Chen described how the clinic had saved thousands of lives that would have been turned away by traditional hospitals, even the most hardened board members found themselves nodding. The vote wasn't even close. The merger passed overwhelmingly, with only the luxury spa developers and their allies opposing. As the celebration began, Mrs. Richardson surprised everyone by hugging Robert Chen, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me see what really matters." 3 months later, the newly renamed Richardson Chen Memorial Hospital celebrated its grand reopening. The free clinic had been expanded, integrated seamlessly with the main hospital. Photos of David Richardson and Michael's grandfather hung prominently in the entrance hall, their story finally public and honored. At the ceremony, Eleanor Richardson and Robert Chen cut the ribbon together, symbolizing the bridging of past and present. Dr. Richardson had never looked prouder, standing between his mother and his future son-in-law, his prejudices replaced by understanding and respect. Sarah and Michael's wedding followed a week later, held in the hospital's healing garden. It was Mrs. Richardson who insisted on this unconventional venue, saying it perfectly represented their family's journey. She'd become the merger's biggest champion, using her social connections to raise unprecedented funding for the hospital's community programs. as the newlyweds shared their first dance, surrounded by hospital staff, clinic patients, and society figures all celebrating together. Michael leaned close to Sarah's ear. "You know," he whispered, "I almost gave up on this place, on your family, on everything. But sometimes the hardest walls to break down lead to the most beautiful views." Sarah smiled, watching her grandmother and Robert Chin chatting animatedly about expanding the clinic's services. "Love," she replied, "has a way of breaking down all the right walls." The story of the billionaire who dressed poor to expose prejudice became a local legend, but the real story, of two families overcoming decades of prejudice to build something extraordinary together, became something much more valuable, a blueprint for change. As for the journal that started it all, it found a new home in a display case in the hospital lobby, open to David Richardson's final entry. "Today I learned that wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the bridges we build. May future generations build bridges where we once saw walls." And beside it, a small plaque reads, "Some legacies are written in journals, others in the hearts we change. Welcome to a place where everyone matters."